Okay, so Barbara Weinstein is a professor of history at New York University and was once the president of the American Historical Association. Today, we will be discussing her book, The Color of Modernity, published in 2015 by Duke University Press. So, thank you for joining me.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
This is a question I always start with, and then I always tell everyone I always start with it. So, that's going to be a running pattern. How did you come into the field of history? What made you want to study São Paulo and Brazilian history?
So I was drawn to history as the broader field by my involvement in radical politics as an undergraduate. There are other fields I might have gone into. A lot of people who I knew who were involved in left politics at the time went into sociology. But I found history to be more useful to me, at least, in terms of trying to understand the things that my politics drove me to want to understand. And I very early on decided that I didn't want to do European history or US history, but I wanted to do what we used to call third world history. And I had studied Spanish as a junior high school and high school student. That seemed somehow easier than studying Mandarin or Japanese. And so because I was interested in both the Chinese and the Cuban revolutions. And I ultimately decided that I would go with Latin American history. So it came very specifically out of a political experience. I was not a history buff as a child or anything like that. So yeah, that's basically
okay, interesting. And then how did it jump from, because Spanish is not Brazil, so how did it
sure.
Latin America Spanish and then to Brazil?
US. So I didn't at first think I wanted to study São Paulo. My first book, in fact, was on the Amazon.
Okay.
So which is in Brazil kind of regarded as the opposite of São Paulo.
Right.
But my interest in Brazil has a very specific origin story, which is that I arrived at Yale, where I did my PhD, wanting to study labor history. I had read in my senior year as an undergraduate, I read E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. And it didn't make me want to study English history, but it did make me want to study labor history. And I thought I would do Argentina because Argentina at that point had the most developed historiography on labor. And, was sort of, if you wanted to write about labor, that was kind of the obvious place to go. But my advisor at Yale ended up somewhat to my surprise, and later my pleasant surprise, that ended up being a Brazilian historian, a very eminent Brazilian historian, Emília Viotti da Costa, who had been forcibly retired from the University of São Paulo by the military regime, and had ended up after a couple of years at Yale. And she very much wanted a student who was studying Brazil. I mean, she was a historian of Brazil studying, suddenly advising students who are studying, Mexico and Peru and, and Argentina. And she kept on saying, no, it'd be better to do Brazil, And eventually I had studied some Portuguese as an undergraduate. So eventually I said, okay, I'm gonna switch to Brazil. And so it was really her influence. I'm very grateful to her for any number of reasons. It was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life. So.
What was your first experience in Latin America? I think I read on some bio of you that you ended up on a research grant in Uruguay, or?
Yeah, that was as an undergraduate. I was 20 years old, and I got a little research grant to do research for my senior thesis in Montevideo. So that's the first time I was ever out of the United States. I went all by myself, just to no study away program for me or anything like that. I just landed in Montevideo, somehow managed to figure out where to live and on a very small grant, and make my way through the Biblioteca Nacional. And so my senior thesis was actually on the collapse of electoral politics and the rise of the Tupamaros in Uruguay. And it was just before, it was the year before it was during a declared state of internal warfare. I'm not using that as a loose term. That was the formal term.
Mhm.
And all my professors tried to convince me not to go. And, but I was a stubborn kid. And so, and it was just, it was sobering and fascinating. I didn't I didn't think being an Uruguayanist would be a kind of feasible career move. Even then, I knew enough to know that if you specialized in Uruguayan history, that was kind of what we would now call a niche field.
Mhm.
But so kind of the connection with Argentina, though, it was sort
Right.
of thought, all right, I'm going to move to the larger country in the area. But yes, so that was my first experience in Latin America. It was a really kind of amazing experience in many ways. I spent my weekends with a family that lived in what they call a cantegril in Uruguay, which would be like a favela
Mm.
in and they were one of the older, more established families, so they had a slightly more sturdy home. But but I also got to know a very eminent sociologist, Carlos Real de la Sua, who was kind of became my mentor. He knew my advisor, and that sort of that was the connection. And he introduced me. He said, "Who do you want to interview?" So I said, Eduardo Galeano. And he said, okay, I'll set it up. So I actually, as a 20-year-old undergraduate, conducted an interview with Eduardo Galeano. So somebody asked me once, how did he act toward you? I said, I think appropriately condescending.
So, well, like, I mean, that must have been such a big experience for you. Was there any kind of moment of culture shock you remember in particular that kind of crystallized your like uh what you've already stated, like you like more radical politics that kind of emphasized that for you?
Well, I mean, there were several things. I will say I grew up in Brooklyn. I was a New Yorker. I had been, at this point, I had gone to many protests and anti-war rallies where we were tear gassed and so on. So I was not easily shocked. I would say probably the most shocking moment is one time as I was going to the Biblioteca Nacional, the police actually shot somebody who
Mm.
was fleeing the police, and it was a political. It wasn't I'd seen lots of criminal, quote unquote, situations in New York at that time, but this so that was that was of course shocking. And there was one moment when I was taking photographs and a car drove up and demanded to see my identification. And they said, you're taking photographs too close to the US consulate or the US embassy. And you don't. And once they saw I was from the United States, I knew, I mean, I wasn't shocked that they would treat me differently. I knew, as soon as they saw that, they would treat me differently. But still, the mere fact that I was taking photographs invited, a police inquiry that was sobering.
Mhm.
But I would say the thing I was most freaked out by was when I went to Buenos Aires as a woman walking around alone. And again, I was quite young, I was 20 years old. It was practically impossible to walk around by myself. Men would follow me. And I assure you, it wasn't because I was an unusually attractive woman. I was just a completely ordinary looking woman. And, but that degree of, intrusion into a woman walking around alone was amazing to me. I had never experienced it to that degree. And one of the things that I was, pleasantly surprised by when I got to Brazil is that it was, why men would make comments and so on, but it wasn't that kind of intrusiveness that so it wasn't like Latin culture was like that.
Right.
There's something specific about
Buenos
Argentina.
Aires, yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's intense.
mm.
Uh, so for this book, what was the hardest part of the research? Did you actually go to specific archives, and did you have trouble having access to those archives, or do you have enough of a backload of notes from just all of your books that you were able to kind of build it from there?
No, I mean this was really almost all the research. My three books, each of my books on they're all on Brazil, but they're each on a completely different. There's no spillover
Mhm.
from the second book for Social Peace in Brazil. There's a little spillover into Color of Modernity because they're both on São Paulo. They're both on 20th century São Paulo, but really very little. And so this was entirely, almost completely from scratch. And in terms of getting access to archives, mainly the main problem I've always had is that, often the material I want to use is not organized in any, I just have to go through piles and piles and see if there's anything
Mhm.
useful. In this case, the collection in the State Archive of São Paulo, the Arquivo Público do Estado, did have a fairly well organized collection on the 1932 uprising. And the municipal archive for the city of São Paulo had a very good had a good collection for the documentation of the Quarto Centenario, the 400th anniversary of São Paulo's founding, which is the second part of the book. And so there, in some sense, I picked this topic, and I'll tell this is not your usual answer to what kind of challenges do you have in your research, but in the early, I guess it was the early 90s, my son was diagnosed with autism. And what that meant is that I could not pack up the family, and he was struggling to be fluent in English. And so
Mhm.
taking him to a non-English speaking environment would have been just too challenging.
Mhm.
And also taking him out of programs he was in, he would have lost his place. And so, so in effect, it became a situation where I had to go to Brazil by myself, leave my two small children, including my son with autism, with my husband. So I didn't go to Brazil for more than 3 weeks at a time.
Mhm.
And so I chose this project, the Color of Modernity project, in part because I thought the material, and it was true, the material in general was better organized than for my previous two books. That's not saying a ton because the material for the second book, I had to sort of create my own archive. But this was a less challenging one. And a lot of the sources I used were print sources that I could access in the United States, if not in my own library through
Mhm.
interlibrary loan. So so the challenge was really a challenge of my personal life rather than the archives per se.
Gotcha. Uh, when you were first kind of thinking about the book, uh, it seems like you're trying to interject on Gramscian cultural hegemony and kind of the discourse around that. But I was curious, is there like to how much of that was you went in with this kind of idea of what you wanted to do with the book, and how much of it was just finding things in the archive and then having like an aha moment of like, okay, no, this is like what I've was didn't realize I was looking for, and but now I found it.
Now, this was a case where I don't want to overstate it, but I my idea for the book, it was the inspiration for the book came from the previous book, even though it was a very different book, because I felt that for Social Peace in Brazil, I had worked, reasonably well with the category of class, and to some extent well with the category of gender, but not with the category of race. But I constantly felt this sense that race was there in a lot of the documentation I was using, but not explicitly so, as is often the case in Brazil. So Brazil, certainly I would not say Brazil is a racial democracy, but there is um, in many of both official and unofficial circles in Brazil, a sense that one does not speak too bluntly about race. And so unlike people doing research on so regional identity and racism in the United States, where you could hardly go 1 minute without finding evidence of that. In Brazil, people would talk about things in ways that you knew was sort of tinged with certain racial assumptions, but not explicitly. And so I started thinking, well, how can you get at it? How can you, I can't just keep insisting it's about race if I don't, what kind of evidence? And one of the things that became clear and clear to me was the way in which the entire project around São Paulo's emergence as Brazil's leading industrial and most modern center. And indeed, it was the biggest industrial for many years, the biggest industrial center in all of Latin America, that it sort of the whole discourse of São Paulo's exceptionalism was a racialized discourse. And once I came to that conclusion, it was actually quite easy to find evidence of it and to see the way in which modernity in general is coded white, but the way in the particular way it's coded white in the context of São Paulo, which not only sort of whitens São Paulo, but heightens its whiteness vis-a-vis and its modernity vis-a-vis other parts of Brazil that are then coded as non-white.
Mm-hmm. So, like, if I'm understanding you correctly, is it more that region and race have just become kind of intermixed and connected, or is it just genuinely that it's region is kind of a code term for race?
Well, I'd say I think kind of those are the same things. I think that because now when I say region and race to get connected, I don't mean in the physical sense of actual existing people in different places. Of course, there are some regions of Brazil that are blacker and whiter than others. So if you go to Santa Catarina in the south of Brazil, the vast majority of the population is white. You go to Bahia, the vast majority of the population is Black or some mixture of Black and white. So there are variations in the racial profile, let's say, of different regions. But this kind of contrast between São Paulo and, let's say, the northeast of Brazil was being drawn when São Paulo was still a region with a very large Afro-descended population. So the sort of, and what I'm interested in is not just the literal whitening, that is the bringing in of immigrants from Europe, but rather the way in which the whole image of São Paulo is whitened even before the population isn't whitened. So, if you do this as a podcast, I guess my air quotes won't translate. So in a sense, what I say in the book is that race and region fused, so that certain regions become the white Brazil and others the Black Brazil or the brown Brazil. And so it's but I also think that one of the reasons this happens is because it's easier to talk about regional difference in Brazil than to talk about racial difference. I think now everybody, and it's not so much now easier to do because everybody knows, when somebody in São Paulo, a Paulista, refers to a Nordestino, that it already is a racially coded term. But the period I'm writing about, you could write about regional difference without somebody saying, "Oh, you're being racist," and we don't do that in Brazil. So, but now I think it is evident that that when Northeasterners started coming to São Paulo, the fact that they were called Baianos, even no matter what state they were coming from, indicated a certain racialized assumption about that.
Yeah. So this is, it's a study on race in Brazil, but it's also a study on a specific region, and you're doing something interesting, talking about region and the how region plays into nationalism and nation. So I was wondering if you could talk about that for a little bit, and also talk about the pros and cons of a regional study.
So one of the things I'm, very insistent on in the book is that this is not a regional study, and even though it is focused on a particular region, in that I'm really interested in São Paulo and that's, the subtitle, São Paulo and the Making of Race and Nation in Brazil. The subtitle is different. The Portuguese edition just came out last year, and so 2021 is now last year. No, I'm sorry, 2022 is now last year. So the pandemic, I think, has made everybody's sense of time kind of get a little crazy. So no, it came out in 2022, was last year, and they put a different subtitle. It's Whiteness and the Formation of Paulista Identity. And I actually, wish they had left the sort of nation formation. I'm glad. I think whiteness will signal to people sort of what I'm working on, but I feel like the nation piece is missing, because one of the arguments I'm trying to make is that São Paulo is not retreating from the nation and trying to sort of just create a regional power base, but rather constructing their region as the nation. And I would argue that that is always particularly in a large country, but even in some countries that are not particularly large, you have people are constructing their vision of the nation from the sort of locale where they're located, they're situated. And so one of the books that was very influential in the way I thought about this is Prasenjit Dwara's book, Rescuing History from the Nation, in which he talks about the way in which provincial identities in China were the basis for constructing various discourses of Chinese nationalism. And so I'm trying to do a similar thing. I'm trying to show that it's not that the people in the Northeast have a national vision and the people in São Paulo have an only regional vision. They just have different they have different regionally informed national visions. So this is not a regional study. It's a study of the relationship between region and nation. And I think that that's the problem with the historiography that is would call themselves regional studies, is that they are not kind of sufficiently engaged with the relationship between region and nation, and often take region as a given. But of course, a region is a politically constructed and an imagined place. It's not even more, in some sense, even more, to go back to Benedict Anderson, all nations are imagined communities, but regions are even more imagined because they often exist without any specific geopolitical borders.
Okay, so because you bring in Gramsci and Said for a bit, are you trying to argue that you need to bring in regionalism? Are you trying to argue that it's not simply a matter of specific groups of elites? It's that there can also be regional groups within a nation state that perform cultural hegemony and kind of like imperialize a country, but like internally.
Yeah. So Gramsci is very good. Gramsci is always useful, but for me, he's specifically useful in his the way he interpreted the northern bourgeoisie in Italy as constructing a hegemonic position. What can they construct that will create a bond between the bourgeoisie and the emerging northern proletariat. And he sees that as being constructed around a shared notion of their superiority to the more rural south, the southern Italy, Sicily, the poorer, dark, even sort of seen as darker, so, and in fact probably literally somewhat the case. So he's starting with this idea that the bourgeoisie, I mean, I would never put it, I think it kind of overstates the sort of crafty bourgeoisie, kind of. So I think a lot of these things, nobody's planning them. Nobody is staying up at night saying, how can we get people who are not in the elite to support us? But or maybe somebody is, but I think that's not the usual way it happens. But in effect, what you have is an elite group that is suddenly, really quite suddenly in historical time, finds itself as benefiting from a coffee boom in São Paulo at a moment of abolition of slavery, weakening of the empire. Brazil is about to become a republic. So, it's a moment, it's a kind of pivotal moment. And they are clearly trying to figure out, what is the best position to take for this moment where, things are changing very rapidly. And, their notions of São Paulo as superior to the rest of Brazil are, people, it's not surprising. It's an appealing notion. Who doesn't want to think just by virtue of where they live, they're better? They don't have to do anything. They just have to be in that place. So I don't think they necessarily planned this as a kind of Gramsci's notion of a hegemonic project that will bring in other social classes. But in fact, that's part of the effect it has.
So also in the little bio I had read, it mentioned something where I believe it was when you were first going to Princeton or somewhere or other.
That's where I was an undergraduate.
And it was the first time you had an experience where of having the WASP meeting like white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, whereas previously most of the Protestants you had met were Black in New York, and who you would consider white were mostly Jewish neighbors, etc. Was that like
some Catholics, some Italian Catholics?
Right. Was that like your first kind of real experience of what does whiteness mean? Because you do kind of delve into what whiteness means to certain people in certain times in Brazil, in São Paulo. And I was curious if there was any relation to your own story of you thinking about that yourself and then that being reflected in the work.
Yeah, I don't think I thought about it in terms of whiteness, but I did certainly think about it in terms of social class. And it's not that I didn't know that there were social classes in the United States and the world, but it materialized it for me in a way that I, wasn't prepared for. And, all kinds of ways in which, well, let me just step back and say that, I'd always been a good student. And I was from, a very lower middle class family, grew up in Brooklyn, went to a regular old New York City public high school. But because I had been a good student, there was this sort of assumption that, well, I could kind of be whatever I wanted. And I don't think I ever had a strong notion of being disadvantaged in any way, even though I was from a very modest family in a fairly modest neighborhood. But as soon as I got to Princeton, I very quickly perceived the way in which I was educationally disadvantaged. I just to give you a very quick example. The girl in the next room and I both took the placement exam for French, and I had taken a couple of years of French in high school, and I thought I was already doing pretty well. And yet I only placed in like the second year, where she placed out completely. She didn't have to take any introductory French courses. And I said, wow, you must be really good at languages. She says, well, I spent the summer in French camp in France. And I said, oh, I spent the summer working in a child medical care clinic, a medical care clinic for children in Brooklyn, typing and writing up reports and so on. So it was just suddenly, I'd never known anybody who could spend the summer in France, learning French. So that, and I didn't feel particularly resentful. I was just kind of, I was more curious than anything. I had thought of myself as a good athlete, but I'd never gone skiing. I didn't go to tennis clubs. It's like some people did all these things really well that I, never had any thought of doing. Never mind, I never could do. I never even thought about doing. So it was a different world, and it was a world where you could see very quickly. Oh, yeah. The other thing I should mention is that people would crack up when I started talking because I had such a heavy Brooklyn accent. And I still have a New York accent, but I had a much heavier Brooklyn accent then. So all of a sudden, I was things about me that I'd never given a second thought became an object of, of difference. And so I guess somewhere in there is also a story about whiteness or, waspiness, but I mainly saw it through the lens of social class, and I'm sure it contributed to my sort of radicalization. I was already kind of a hippie and going to anti-war rallies before I got to Princeton, and then I just became more radicalized.
So with that said, what is whiteness in the context of Sao Paulo? Because sometimes in Latin America, whiteness is simply like property class, like money whitens is like a common saying. But you're also suggesting that it's also regional in aspect. And in my own experience, my wife is Colombian. I lived in Colombia for a couple of years. Like I do know that there's like Medellin, people from Antioquia, like they're white, and then the coast is darker. And there's also this kind of regional class clash based more on regionalism necessarily than property or skin color even. So I'm curious what exactly is whiteness in Sao Paulo? Is it a means for modernization? Is it a stand-in for civilization? The Germans have a good term for it, but I can't remember it right now. Or is it purely regional, or how do all these things intersect?
Well, one of the things that I say throughout the book is that whiteness is unstable. So to say it's one thing would be, inaccurate. And so there are, at different moments, there are different sort of implications of, who, sort of different boundaries of who and who isn't white and what it means to be white. So in São Paulo, like the rest of Brazil, there are many people who are in the elite who probably have some descent. In fact, several quite prominent people in kind of new modernizing elites who have some descent from, in a distant past, enslaved people of African descent. So whiteness isn't in Sao Paulo what whiteness would have been in the Jim Crow South. So there's not a kind of notion of racial purity, and because of that, I've been a little bit reluctant to use the term white supremacy in my work, gotten a little more comfortable because of the context now in Brazil, where that's a term that's used a lot in, particularly in, sort of Black consciousness, Black rights movements. So, but precisely because there isn't that kind of strict emphasis on biological whiteness that that typically goes together with white supremacy. That I was reluctant to use the term. But what I think we can see is the way in which sort of being Paulista becomes equivalent to a kind of whiteness, and over time, what that means is also that the lines between Paulista and not Paulista become sharper, so that when hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of Nordestinos start coming to São Paulo, rather than them, turning into Paulistas, they are seen as a different group. And they themselves, out of their experience of discrimination as Nordestinos, start to take on, in some sense, they arrive thinking they're from Bahia, they're from Paraíba, from Ceará, they're from Pernambuco, but they become Nordestino in São Paulo because of the sort of general sort of blanket kind of disparagement of the Nordestino. So not only is whiteness a somewhat more complicated category in São Paulo than it would be, for example, in the Jim Crow South, but also to understand it, I think we have to look at how São Paulo positions itself vis-a-vis other parts of Brazil.
So it also seems like what you're saying is that modernity or prosperity is kind of in there's a feedback mechanism of being white, proclaiming themselves as modern and white, then they are perceived as prosperous and modern, and so then they get more opportunities, and then it kind of feeds into itself. And in the same ways in the Northeast, because there's kind of this conception and perception that it's underdeveloped and it's poor or lazy or all the stereotypes, then people kind of either take that on or are treated as if that were the reality, and then that affects their economic status. So my question is, to what
That's a very good summary of what I'm arguing. Thank you.
So my question is, to what is the function of culture and othering in economic development then in what you've found in this book?
Well, in the particular moment that I'm looking at, so the period from sort of the early 20th century into the 1960s, I would say that it's othering basically operates to privilege the economic needs of the dominant region. And it's interesting to see the way in which this takes on a life of its own. It starts becoming a machine that goes of itself, because you have one political administration after another that declares its goal to be to diminish the inequalities between regions in Brazil. And by the time that administration is over, São Paulo is even more dominant in the sort of more advanced, quote unquote, sectors of the economy. So, Getúlio Vargas, when he's the elected president of Brazil from 50 to 54, makes it very clear that that's his goal, to decrease regional inequalities. But by the time we get to the late 50s, São Paulo is, sort of producing over two thirds of the sort of, heavier industrial goods that Brazil is producing. So it's become even more established as the center of industrialization and economic modernity. So that, so what I would say is one of the advantages of othering is that São Paulo can say, well, we have to do something to make sure people aren't starving in the Northeast. Well, maybe we have to do something, but there's no point in spending a lot of capital on industrializing the Northeast because they clearly don't have what it takes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've taken up a lot of your time, so I'll end with this question, and it's a fun one. It's simply, what book in your field do you think that more people should be reading or noticing besides your own book?
Okay. Well, I guess it depends upon what you mean by my field. If you mean Latin American history, um,
Whatever you feel it
is it?
means.
Okay.
I'll leave it open-ended.
Well, I definitely, more people should be reading implies that not enough people are reading it. And this book that I'm going to mention, I think is a fabulous book, but I think a lot of people will read it, but it's relatively new, which is Paulina Alberto's new book, Black Legend. And I'm trying to remember the subtitle of the book. I think I have it right here. No, I do not. Okay, 1 second. No. But it is a brilliant study of a man named Raul Grijera, who was a sort of figure in art Buenos Aires porteño nightlife in the early 20th century, who was Black. He was known as El Negro Raul. Um, and she looks at him, uses his sort of life and career, so to speak, to understand the way in which his very Blackness allowed the people around him to stress the whiteness of Argentine society. So, not entirely disconnected from what I'm trying to do in The Color of Modernity, but it's a beautifully written and incredibly researched book that I can't recommend strongly enough.
Okay, perfect.